So, my name's Dearbhail, and I tell stories. I'm a journalist, I'm an author, I'm a broadcaster, I'm a talker, I'm a listener, I'm an observer, a narrator of sorts. And I'd like to speak to you today about story. I'm all of these things, but in truth, what I really am is just another soul trying to make sense of events as they unfold in the world in the fairest and the most accurate way that I can. We are very, very lucky to live in a country that is steeped, rich in a tradition of storytelling. The Shanachie, those old storytellers of lore, who took our history and our laws and our traditions and passed them down orally over the centuries. We live in quite a quick-witted country, one that revered the bard, feared the bard, who used to satirise and shame their patrons if they didn't pay up or didn't behave themselves. Ireland is a wonderful country that has venerated its storytellers. But it's also a country that has isolated and banned and censored and exiled them too. And I believe that the long arm of censorship still holds us in its subtle, sometimes not so subtle, and sometimes sinister grip. Edna O'Brien, one of the greatest writers this country ever produced, once spoke about censorship. And she was asked in an interview about censorship, and bearing in mind that many of her books were banned, The Country Girls. And she said, censorship is rooted in fear, a fear of knowledge, a fear of our own desires, a fear of secrets, and a fear of our stream of consciousness. As a professional journalist, I ask, and I am asked 100 times every day, what's the story? My life is immersed in stories. And I've been thinking lately about stories, especially now here in Ireland, as we are approaching very nervously, very, very tentatively, this 1916 centenary celebrations. Feeling and noticing the commemoration anxiety around the 1916 centenary. Wondering who's going to tell that story? How are we going to tell that complex story? Who's going to be in power when that story is told? And what I want to share with you today is what I've learned about stories, about why they matter, about their huge transformative potential, and about their destructive force, about what happens when we suppress, ignore, and demonize each other's stories, and how we can literally turn the page of our human experience if we're open to the possibility of our perceptions and our stories being challenged. A little bit about my own story. I grew up in Northern Ireland at the height of a 30-year conflict that became simply known as the Troubles. It's a bizarre euphemism, but the Troubles claimed more than 3,000 lives. It wounded, scarred, and mentally wounded hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands more. It shattered communities, some of those communities separate but related by the ironically titled Peace Wall, of which there are hundreds. And it cast a long shadow for generations in Northern Ireland. One of my earliest memories, and I'm sure you all have it too, is sitting on your parents' knee being read stories. The Aesop fables, the Brothers Grimm, or for us, I don't know if some of you might be too young to remember it, but the Childcraft series, the Childcraft Encyclopedia series. And you'd be sitting on your parents' knee, but you'd be transported all around the world through nursery stories, through rhymes, through stories about different cultures. And I think that's where I first got my first love of travel, my childhood. I also remember soldiers with guns on our streets, in your garden, near the playground. I have a distinct memory of huddling in school or at home when there was a bomb scare, and the confusion and the fear and the noise and the sirens when one detonated. I'm 37 years of age, and I still have a fear of driving along country roads late at night because of the experience of army checkpoints. This is when a red light would form in the distance and slowly start to turn, not unlike the green light in S. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, except that was a green light of hope. This was a red light that just flowed in the distance, that circled, and as you got closer, there was a hush that went in the back of the car. Me and my sisters gabbling, we'd all stop, because there was a hand at the end of that torch, and you didn't know if it was the British Army, if it was the IRA, the UVF, or someone else, with a torch in one hand and a gun in the other. And these are just fragments of memory. It's not things I think about very, very often, because these are stories that are deep in the recess of your mind, that you normalised at the time, because to us as young children, it was a very, very perfect and normal childhood. I was speaking to a friend earlier this week about this phenomenon, and she recounted the story of a young boy during the Troubles who was on a school bus and looked out the window and saw a funeral cortege and said, "The news," because it's kind of quite funny, but it's kind of quite devastating. because for a while, that was our story. That was the news. And it was an extraordinary experience during those times. I remember as a young teenager being fascinated by the news, being fascinated that journalists from all over the world, Kate Eady always sticks out in my mind, but that these journalists from around the world would come to our tiny little corner of the world to tell the outside world our story. I remember at that time reading Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Yay, there's a prequel coming out. But I remember reading that story, and I think that's where I honed my first sense of injustice. And I remember trying to apply the extraordinary morale of that parable, of that awesome story, to the reality that we were living in. And that was extraordinary. And I wonder, was it that book? I wonder, was it the times that I lived in? I wonder, was it seeing the Book of Kells for the first time in Trinity that led me first into the doors of law school and later into journalism to this very university at DCU. I'm going to tell you one or two things that I've learned about stories, 6 of them actually. 1, we are all storytellers. The art of story, the art of communicating our stories is the very basic hallmark of our human condition and experience. We've been telling stories since the beginning of time, since cavemen drew little squiggles on the walls. We tell stories from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed at night. And we are obsessed by stories. We're telling stories before we even know how to speak or walk or talk. Think of the amount of times you hit on YouTube to see some crazy little toddlers gabbling away in their little world and in their little stories. I have massive conversations with my 2.5-year-old godson who navigates his life story with 4 keywords: no, mine, phone, and his own little version of love you. There are 2 sides to every story. I wonder about this one. Because if I've learned anything as a professional journalist, and if I learned anything as a journalist who has committed most of my writing life to writing about the law, is that there's always more than 2 sides to every story. There's your side, there's their side, and there's the real story, or the actual story, which lies somewhere in between. There's your side, there's their side. Nobody's lying, nobody at fault. But if you want to reconcile a conflict, if you want to reconcile your differences, you have to think of the other person's story. I see this all the time. 9 out of 10 cases settle in the courts, and everybody goes in and they think they've got the law and the facts on their side. And it's not just legal costs that keeps 9 of those 10 cases out of court, although it probably helps. But one of the reasons is that the reality is that there's another side of the story. I cover a lot of murder cases in the criminal courts, and sometimes the only certainty in a murder case is that somebody has been killed. It gets a little bit more complicated when you try and work out, well, did the person who's in the box, did the accused, did they murder that person? And juries have to consider these complex facts, the aspects of a story. They have to consider, well, did they actually murder them? Or in fact, was there a different side to that story? Was there provocation? Was there different elements that would reduce it from murder to manslaughter? Was there something about what happened on that day or that night which means that the accused person is not guilty of murder at all? So that's kind of one of the things that I've learned, is there are at a very, very basic minimum 3 sides to every story. Number 3, and it's my favourite, there's always a backstory. There is always a backstory. There's always a background, context, or set of facts, or chain of events that leads up to the main story or the main plot of our lives that we try and present to others or reveal to others. There is always a backstory, and the real story or our truth often lurks and skulks in the backstory. And when I meet you for the first time, I'm interested in your story. I'm fascinated by your first draft, how you tell it, but really, I'm thinking and I'm listening and I'm looking out for your backstory. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes me a terrible first date. Because I'm always looking for the backstory. He wants to go for coffee and I want to know what side of the Civil War his grandparents were on. It gets intense. Number 4, we constantly edit stories. We constantly revise and edit our stories because what we're actually trying to do is control the story. We constantly edit and revise stories because what we're trying to do is to affirm our perception, to confirm it, to reaffirm it, to put it out there. And this can cause a huge difficulty. It's been happening, though, since the beginning of time. The Catholic Church is one such example, or the early church. They picked Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They said, here are the 4 accounts that bear the closest similarities. Here's what we want to say. We'll keep all of those, and we're going to dismiss everything else. And lo and behold, all of the other Gospels eventually Some of them, at least, made their way. But there was an example of the oral tradition being handed down, and when it came to the written press, we knew that the story had to be controlled. And as writers, what we often say is the writing is in the rewriting. The real writing is in the rewriting. And for good, bad, or indifferent, it actually is. Number 5, facts are sacred. You've probably heard this phrase a lot. Comment is free, but facts are sacred. It was Charles Preswick Scott, I think in the 1830s, the former editor of the then Manchester Guardian, when he was asked about his view on newspapers, he came up with this phrase. He says, comment is free and facts are sacred. But there's something true meaning in that cliche, because facts are sacred. Robert McKee, the great storyteller, says, facts are sacred because facts are neutral. They are what they are. Man bites dog is a fact. Why the hell the man bit the dog is a completely different story. It's a fact that almost 3,000 people lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks in the United States of America. Something I will never forget because I was there that day in New York City. Something that really, really made me want to become a journalist. And it's easy to say it's a fact that 3,000 people died. What it's much harder to do is to tell the story of that, to go beyond the what and tell the how and the why. Why did those people die? What motivated their killers to act in the way that they do? And it's a much, much more complex story. My last observation is that facts are not the truth. And if you take something away from my talk today, is that facts are not the truth. The truth, or what becomes our truth, is what we impose and superimpose on the facts. The truth, or what becomes our stated truth, is what we want the facts to be, what we think about the facts. And the same story, the same set of facts, can speak different truths to different people, to different tribes, depending on their context, depending on their perceptions, depending on their backstory, and depending on what they want to hear. So sometimes we hold forth our truth when in fact really it's what we want to hear. A silly example. The lady at the end of Banking 365 says, Miss McDonald, we have increased your credit card limit. I hear she's given me a new target. Ladies and gentlemen, we sometimes hear what we try and assert a truth is what we want to hear. So why do stories matter? Stories matter because we live and die by story. We survive and thrive by story. All it takes is one story to change the course of history, to break down barriers, to get the type of breakthroughs that myself and all of our participants have been speaking about here today. To make us one story, all it takes is one story to radically alter the way we think about the world and how we think about ourselves. Think of Rosa Parks, the First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement, who changed the course of history when she refused to give her seat on a bus to a white person. Think of Malala, the young woman shot by the Taliban just because she wanted an education. They shot her, but they didn't kill her. They shot her and they didn't silence her. And I think you'll agree she's become one of the most amazing voices in the world to advocate for the education of women. There are plenty of examples. Think closer to home. Think of Maria Cahill. Think of all the victims of rape and sexual violence who have refused to be silenced by the censors, who have gone public, who have waived their right to anonymity, to come forward and tell their story and shine a light on a very, very dark corner of our human experience. Incredible stories, life-changing stories, necessary stories. But the opposite must hold true, because we get in trouble when we don't create space for stories to be told. We get in trouble when we hold fast to self-evident truths that on closer reflection are perhaps not as self-evident or true as we assert them to be. We get into difficulty when we allow a dominant narrative to take hold without any question, without any challenge, without any interrogation. Just think of Nazi Germany as one example. It's an entirely different context, but just think of the recent global financial crisis, in part caused by a colossal groupthink. We didn't want to hear the voices of those who had a different view, an alternative view, because we were so hard and fastened to that. I think that the social fabric rips and tears when we allow the search for truth, and we're all on that journey, whether you know it or not, but when we allow that search for truth to be hijacked by tribes, be they governments, tyrants, be they religious faiths or different cultures. Just think of the amount of people who have died and who are dying because of a literal interpretation of texts and books and orthodoxies that have themselves been edited within an inch of their lives. Think of the people who are suffering and who are being persecuted because of their beliefs, because another tribe comes in and says, our belief is better than yours. And after 12 years of being a journalist, I think that if freedom of expression is to mean anything, if we want to achieve the goal of living in an open and a tolerant and a peaceful society, we have to create spaces for our stories to be told. We have to be able to live, breathe, tell and sell our own stories. That doesn't mean that our story is absolute, because stories, like rights, conflict and collide, and when they do, we have to engage in a very, very delicate balancing act. It's not always possible, as in law, to achieve the perfect balance, and sometimes that can lead to a bit of a hierarchy, and that can be hard to stomach. But the one thing that we cannot do is suppress story. Because when we suppress story, when we don't stop and listen, it has a horrible, brutal tendency to manifest itself in other forms. Violence, conflict, and terror, which tell their own story. I think that untold and undertold stories are much like unrequited love. They can wreak a terrible and awful agony. We live in a great paradox. Everyone here today has talked about the opportunities presented by the internet. We live in a time of great opportunity and great threat. The internet and advances of technology have revolutionised the way we tell our stories, the way we communicate with each other. A fragment of a story, a snippet of a story, can become a global phenomenon in 140 characters or less within minutes, possibly seconds. Those faraway global conflicts that we needed the Kate 80s of this world and others to bring into our world, to mediate and explain to us, can be delivered direct to your inbox or in your Twitter feed. And that immediacy, that intimacy of story has made the task of writing honest, powerful, objective stories much more challenging. But it's also made it much, much more necessary. And that's what I do in my day-to-day life. Our stories are important because they are our lives. And the challenge I would issue to you today is to open yourself up to the possibility of opening your hearts and your minds to other people's stories, to share their stories, share their histories, and share their culture. Because otherwise, we can't get beyond our own stories. We can't get past our own stories. Our stories are important because these are our lives. But there are many, many different stories. We all have our stories. There are at least 3 sides to a story. There is always, always a backstory. And what I would invite you to today is just have a little bit of time to think about that the next time someone asks you, what's the story? Thank you.